The river water looked crystalline that June morning. Families filled their barrels without hesitation, as they had done every day since leaving independence. Children played on the muddy banks while men checked the wagon wheels. The sun had not yet reached its peak when the first woman fell. Her screams echoed through the caravan, abdominal pains so violent they bent her in half. Within minutes, others began vomiting. The diarrhea was watery, incessant, transparent like rice water. Desperation set in when they realized there was no way to stop it. Adult bodies dehydrated within hours. Skin turned blue and wrinkled. Eyes sank into their sockets. Men strong in the morning were corpses by afternoon. The wagons stopped moving forward. There were no doctors. There were no medicines. There was no understanding. Entire families lay writhing on the floors of their own wagons, soaked in their own fluids, begging for water that their bodies could no longer retain. The smell of death, mixed with the acrid odor of disease, transformed the camp into an open-air slaughterhouse. Fathers dug shallow graves to bury children before the sun even set. And then, by the following dawn, it was the fathers who needed to be buried. The trail that promised gold, land, and freedom had become a corridor of silent death. One could walk for miles, following only the improvised crosses and mounds of fresh earth. In some stretches, the horizon was no longer visible, only graves. What those people did not know is that they were facing a microscopic enemy brought from distant ports, carried upriver by the same steamboats that fueled their dreams of conquest. They did not know that the same water keeping them alive was the vehicle of their destruction. And they would never imagine that the great westward expansion, the movement that would define the American nation, would simultaneously be one of the greatest sanitary catastrophes in modern history. This was the cholera epidemic in the Old West, and once it seized a trail, there was no turning back. To understand the magnitude of what was to come, it is necessary first to understand what the American West was before the disease. The 1840s were marked by an unprecedented national fever for expansion. The concept of manifest destiny, the almost religious belief that the United States had the divine right to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, inflamed hearts and minds. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 transformed this abstract ideal into a desperate and concrete rush. Hundreds of thousands of people sold everything they owned, abandoned homes, and set out toward the unknown. Frontier cities like Independence, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, exploded in size. They were departure points for the great trails: the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Santa Fe Trail. These were not simple paths. They were pulsating human arteries, through which flowed entire families in covered wagon caravans, merchants with goods, adventurers, Mormons fleeing persecution, soldiers, prostitutes, preachers, and dreamers. The westward migration was the largest voluntary population movement in American history up to that point. In a single year, it was estimated that more than 50,000 people crossed the Great Plains. These pioneers believed they were building a new civilization. They carried with them seeds, tools, Bibles, weapons, and hopes. The wagons were small mobile worlds, traveling libraries of practical knowledge, portable barns, temporary homes. Communities formed on the trails. Families who had never seen each other before shared campfires, stories, and protection. There was a palpable sense of collective purpose, but this same infrastructure of hope was unknowingly building the perfect road for death. The demographic explosion in frontier cities created catastrophic sanitary conditions. Independence and St. Joseph, cities that normally housed a few thousand inhabitants, saw their populations triple during the caravan departure season between April and June. Improvised camps spread around the outskirts. Latrines were dug hastily, too close to water wells. Human sewage from thousands of people flowed directly into the same rivers from which water was drawn for drinking and cooking. No one understood contamination. The miasma theory, the belief that diseases came from putrid airs and malignant vapors, completely dominated medical thinking of the era. Doctors advised avoiding night air, but said nothing about boiling water. The steamboats that traveled up the Missouri and Mississippi rivers were technological marvels of the age. They shortened journeys that once took months to just weeks. They connected the deep interior of the United States to the ports of the Gulf of Mexico, and it was precisely through these river arteries that the true enemy arrived. The origin of the disaster was not in the West. It was thousands of miles away, on the other side of the planet. Cholera was endemic in the Indian subcontinent, especially in the Ganges River Delta, for centuries. It was a disease of contaminated waters caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, an organism that doctors in 1850 did not even know existed. For generations, cholera had remained relatively contained in its Asian cradle. But the 19th century brought something new: globalization. The British Empire, in its colonial expansion, connected India to the rest of the world through unprecedented maritime trade routes. Merchant ships sailed from Calcutta to London, from Bombay to New York, carrying not only tea, spices, and textiles, but also contaminated ballast water, infected rats, and sick sailors. The first global cholera pandemic began in 1817. The second wave, even more devastating, broke out in 1829 and reached Europe and the Americas for the first time. In 1849, when thousands of Americans were preparing to cross the plains in search of gold, cholera had already reached the ports of New Orleans, New York, and Baltimore. Ships docked with half their crews dead during the Atlantic crossing. Port authorities, alarmed but powerless, tried to implement quarantines. But the disease was already inside the cities, and from there, it began its march inland. The steamboats going up the Mississippi transported passengers crammed into poorly ventilated holds, sharing buckets of contaminated drinking water. When they docked in cities like St. Louis, Memphis, and Cairo, they left behind not only goods, but a trail of infection. The disease spread concentrically from each river port. And when it reached the departure cities of the Western trails, it found the perfect environment for an explosion. Cholera attacks with terrifying speed. The incubation period can be just a few hours. A person healthy in the morning can be dead before nightfall. Watery diarrhea drains the body of up to 20 liters of fluid per day. Dehydration is so extreme that skin loses elasticity, eyes sink, lips turn blue. Violent muscle cramps twist the body into grotesque positions. The victim remains conscious until almost the end, watching their own body consume itself. The mortality rate, without treatment, can exceed 50%. When cholera hit the caravans on the trails, the nightmare assumed unimaginable proportions. Families were not in cities with improvised hospitals or incompetent but useful doctors. They were isolated in a deserted vastness, hundreds of miles from any help. The Great Plains stretched in all directions, an ocean of tall grass under an implacable sky. There was no going back. There was no way to stop. And there was nowhere to run. The first symptoms usually appeared at night. A child would wake up with stomach pains. Within an hour, the entire family was sick. Panic spread through the caravan like fire. Other pioneers pulled back, moving their wagons away from infected families, abandoning them to their own fate in the middle of nowhere. The fear of contagion was stronger than any sense of community or Christian humanity they claimed to profess. The diaries of survivors, those few who managed to record their experiences, are chilling. A man named J. Goldsborough Bruff, leader of a caravan in 1849, described scenes that haunted him for the rest of his life. He found an abandoned wagon with a woman still alive inside, lying amid the bodies of her husband and 3 children, all dead. She begged for water, but no one dared approach. The next morning, when they passed by the place again, she too was dead. her eyes still open, staring at the sky. The doctors who accompanied some caravans had nothing to offer but superstitions disguised as science. They bled patients already dehydrated, removing even more vital fluids from bodies dying of thirst.
Drink this.
They administered opium, mercury, and arsenic, poisons that only accelerated death. They prescribed tobacco enemas, mustard poultices, ice-cold baths that caused fatal thermal shocks. They recommended complete isolation, leaving the sick alone in their sealed wagons, where they died slowly, without comfort, without farewell, without witnesses. The belief in miasma theory led people to light large bonfires, hoping the smoke would purify the cursed air. They burned feathers, sulfur, tar, the nauseating smell mixed with the sweet, rotten odor of death. Some believed the disease was divine punishment sent against those who sought material wealth instead of spiritual salvation. Itinerant preachers appeared in the camps, shouting about the imminent apocalypse and demanding public repentance. Religious hysteria took hold of entire groups. The trails transformed into linear cemeteries. Every mile, new graves marked the passage of death. Many were not even proper graves, just shallow holes dug hastily, covered with rocks to prevent wolves and coyotes from unearthing the bodies. In some cases, there was not even time for that. Bodies were simply left by the roadside, exposed to the elements, to predators, to decomposition under the scorching sun of the plains. The military forts that dotted the trails, built to protect pioneers from Indian attacks, became death traps. Fort Laramie, Fort Kearny, Fort Bridger, all were devastated. Soldiers died in their barracks. Fort cemeteries overflowed. Officers wrote desperate reports requesting doctors, supplies, any kind of help, but nothing arrived in time. And then, cholera began spreading to indigenous populations. The Plains tribes, Pawnee, Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, who already faced the invasion of their lands, now faced a plague brought by the invaders. Their communities, without any immunity or prior knowledge of the disease, were decimated. Entire villages disappeared. The survivors, traumatized, spoke of evil spirits brought by white men, of a curse that killed without touching, that transformed pure water into poison. Moral degradation accompanied the physical. Looting of abandoned wagons became common. Men who called themselves Christians rummaged through the belongings of the dead before the bodies even grew cold. Families were dissolved. Husbands abandoned sick wives. Fathers left children behind. Siblings separated to increase the chances that at least one would survive. Between 1849 and 1855, cholera traveled the trails of the American West in successive waves, each leaving thousands of dead in its wake. It is estimated that between 6,000 and 12,000 pioneers died of cholera on the major trails alone, a number that exceeds all deaths from Indian attacks, wagon accidents, and wild animal attacks combined during the entire era of westward expansion. But the real numbers are certainly much higher, as countless deaths were never recorded, buried in anonymous graves under the infinite sky of the plains. The epidemic did not end through human intervention. It ended because it simply exhausted its accessible victims. As fewer people traveled the trails during the summer months, when conditions were most favorable both for migration and for the proliferation of the bacterium, transmission decreased. Harsh winters killed the bacterium exposed to the environment. And gradually, over years, the wave receded, leaving behind a haunted silence. The cities that had been vibrant departure points became places marked by death. Enormous cemeteries surrounded Independence and St. Joseph, involuntary monuments to human ambition. The survivors who reached California carried not only the physical scars of the journey, but deep psychological traumas that would never be fully healed. Many never spoke about what they witnessed on the trails. Silence became the only way to bear the memories. But the catastrophe forced changes. Authorities began to understand, however vaguely, that something in the water was killing people. Frontier cities implemented the first rudimentary sanitary regulations. Minimum separation between latrines and water sources, prohibition of dumping waste directly into rivers. These were primitive measures born from desperate empirical observation, not scientific understanding. But they saved lives. Westward expansion continued, but transformed. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, shortened a journey of months to less than a week and eliminated dependence on contaminated rivers. The wagon era was coming to an end, replaced by steel, steam, and a new conception of territorial conquest. The event left deep marks on the American psyche. The romantic narrative of the fearless pioneer was tempered by the memory of the brutal price paid. Subsequent generations grew up hearing whispered stories about the trails of death, about entire families that disappeared, about the water that killed. Distrust of medical authority, which failed so spectacularly to protect or cure, took root in rural communities and persists to this day. Cholera would return other times, but never again with the same devastating force on American territory. The discovery of the true cause of the disease by John Snow in 1854, through his meticulous investigation during the London outbreak, and subsequently the identification of the Vibrio cholerae bacterium by Robert Koch in 1883, finally armed humanity with the necessary knowledge. But this knowledge came too late for the thousands who lie beneath the plains. The Great Plains today are vast agricultural fields, cut by interstate highways where trucks travel in hours what once took months. But if one leaves the paved roads and walks through the places where the ancient trails ran, it is still possible to find occasionally a marked stone, a depression in the ground, a trace of deteriorated wood, silent echoes of interrupted lives. And then comes the question that crosses the centuries. When an entire society mobilizes toward a grandiose objective, ignoring invisible warnings, trusting that human will is greater than the forces of nature, how much is it willing to pay? Contaminated water, piled bodies, destroyed families, civilization on the brink of collapse. Does it sound like distant 19th century history? Or does it sound dangerously familiar? History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the rhymes echo through time, waiting for someone to hear them before it is too late.